Hospital porters, pride and dignity, stop the New World Order. Welcome to Hapanwo TV on VidMe. Right, well, today I'm going to talk about something has really got on my nerves, or someone rather who's really got on my nerves. It's the person who normally gets on my nerves when I switch on the TV or radio or something like that, and it's that smiling simian of the small screen, Professor Brian Cox. Professor Brian Cox, I'm so clever and I'm so intelligent and I'm so handsome. Oh yeah, he's excelled himself this time, even his previous endeavours into the extremes of pomposity and ignorance. He's just, I didn't think he could possibly get any more ridiculous than he already has, but he has. What he's done is he claims that ghosts cannot exist. Okay? It doesn't matter how many of you viewers may have seen a ghost or experienced a ghost or anything like that. Whatever ghosts are, he says they just cannot exist. Because guess what? The Large Hadron Collider at CERN would have detected them if they existed. He says ghosts would need to be made of energy and not matter. Seeing as they do not dissipate, they must have some kind of external energy source, and there's nothing that accounts for this in particle physics. And what he does is he recited this little passage. It was on his TV show. His radio show. He has a radio show. I say TV show. That was a bit of a Freudian slip. Of course he has TV shows. He has lots of TV shows. He's always on the bloody TV. I mean, I follow him on Twitter, and I can't help it. It's guilty pleasure, or keep your friends closer, your enemies closer, that sort of thing. Every time he tweets, he's always in some luxurious hotel in some exotic part of the world, making some piece of propaganda for the BBC. And anyway, he has a radio show every week on Radio 4 called The Infinite Monkey Cage, and it was actually a few months ago, it was during their Christmas special, and he said this.
But before we ask the first question, therefore, I want to make a statement. We are not here to debate the existence of ghosts because they don't exist. If we want some sort of pattern that carries information about our living selves to persist, then we must specify precisely what medium carries that pattern and how it interacts with the matter particles out of which our bodies are made. We must, in other words, invent an extension to the standard model of particle physics that has escaped detection at the Large Hadron Collider. That's almost inconceivable at the energy scales typical of the particle interactions in our bodies, and so we need not discuss this further. Does anybody object to that at all? No? Excellent. Carry on.
Now what happens next is his co-host Robin Ince then makes some silly joke about being a psychic and pretending to be a psychic medium for the purposes of balance or something like that. Now the guest on the show is Neil deGrasse Tyson, who's a famous astrophysicist, and he's a skeptic. But he's unlike Cox. He's one of these skeptics I don't mind, because he's modest, more modest than Cox. Well, alright, almost everybody's more modest than Cox, but he's actually quite likeable. He's quite open-minded, he's quite humble, and he's quite approachable. And he says, you just asserted that CERN disproved the existence of ghosts. And you can see he's embarrassed. You can see he's embarrassed by this. And Neil deGrasse Tyson, I say, is someone I quite like. He's a nice skeptic like Carl Sagan, and he's gotten a bit of trouble with the SJWs as well, because this is quite a little bit of an aside. He's a black man, and he's achieved an awful lot in science, and of course everyone who interviewed him was saying, tell us about your experience of racism within the academic establishment and all the institutional abuse you must have suffered for being a black man in a world of the evil white patriarchy. And he says, I didn't suffer any racism. People were absolutely fine with me. I had loads of friends that were black and white, and they were actually okay with me. And then, of course, the SJW say, what? That's the wrong answer. They start calling them what's the word they use, a bounty bar or a coconut or an Oreo. It's what they always call black people who are not black enough or not black in the right way. Anyway, that's I digress. You could see Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's very embarrassed about that. He didn't like it, and he said, "You've just asserted that CERN disproved the existence of ghosts." And Cox says, "Yes, I did." Basically, this whole part of the radio show is a denial of science. Science is the practice of matching theory with observation. So you have a hypothesis, you can make a prediction, then you have to get evidence for that and to see if it's true. Otherwise, it's just a hypothesis that can be anticipated based on what you already know. And what Cox is essentially saying is, I mean, he won't actually admit it, but what he's actually saying is, I don't know anything about ghosts, but I'm presenting a hypothesis, and I don't care if the evidence says anything different. He's basically saying, he's not saying anything, because the thing about Cox is, right, alright, he knows more about particle physics than I would forget in a lunchtime, and anyone watching this would forget in a lunchtime. But it's because of this he when he became a media star, which is about 10 years ago, and he became a household name, and the BBC massaged his ego and boosted him up and made him their poster boy, right? They did it because he knows he's a completely singular-minded man. He knows loads about his specialised subject. I would never dream of trying to debate him on his specialised subject. But he knows nothing about anything else. And therefore, he's the ideal person to talk about things outside his specialist study in the mainstream media. You see? The fact of the matter is, though, if he talks about stuff he doesn't know about because he doesn't know about it, so therefore that's why they give him these little slots in the media. This is why he's used for propaganda like this. If he was a proper scientist in that respect, if the evidence doesn't match the hypothesis, then there's something wrong with the hypothesis. There's not something wrong with the evidence. Now, anyone who is interested in ghosts and looks in and actually gets involved in paranormal investigation, and there's a lot of people who do that, very dedicated, usually unpaid paranormal investigators and psychical researchers all over the world. Most of them, like I say, do it in their spare time. They will discover that there is no doubt that the phenomenon we call ghosts does exist, whatever that might be. If it can't be explained by the known laws of physics, then it means that physicists have more to learn. It's that simple. They have more to learn. And some of the more modest members of the cosmological community are now actually admitting this. They are addressing this point. And they're actually looking into the supernatural, and they're going to events and investigations and things that Cox wouldn't go near if someone drove him there in his BBC Mercedes. Things parallel universes. Scientists seriously discuss parallel universes now. The presence of all kinds of paranormal phenomena, whether it's ghosts, UFOs, or all other kinds of things like that, means there is more questions to be answered. Now, the ultimate objective of physics is what's known as the theory of everything, which is like where basically they come up with some kind of equation that just explains everything in the universe. It explains relativity and quantum theory and matches them together and things like that. It's the final answer of how the universe works. It's the ultimate quest of cosmology. And the truth of the matter is we have a long way to go. And the solution is to do better physics, be a better scientist until this fabled theory of everything is found. But Cox doesn't think like that. Cox and people like him, these media-savvy political figures, essentially, it's different. What they do is they fool others or fool themselves, whichever it is, into believing that they have all the answers in the existing data, and we're on the brink of the theory of everything, and after that everything will be okay. I suppose this kind of carrot and stick sort of method, I suppose it assists with funding, doesn't it? Maybe we should say a little bit more about Professor Brian Cox and explore this man in more detail. Yeah, let's look a little bit more closely and more critically at this man and the role he's currently playing on TV in the world today. I mean, he's done so many TV series now, it's just unbelievable. The one the last one I saw was Science Britannica, which was all right. I admit some of it was good, but it just seems like whenever you want to make a TV show now, you get this guy in, you get this Ponce, this arrogant Ponce with his silky black hair and his shining white teeth. Yes, and his little effeminate voice. And he's so media savvy, and he does such good sound bites, and he looks so good on camera. Ugh. Anyway, who is he? Anyway, let's look into his background. Basically, he was a particle physicist from the University of Manchester, and he was working at CERN, the Large Hadron Collider. And he only became famous really in the mid-2000s when he was a guest capacity speaker in some BBC TV shows, like particularly the Horizon documentaries about Albert Einstein, about the centenary of the theory of relativity. And what point? What can I say? You know, at what point was this decided? I don't know, but at some point they just must have realised opportunity knocks. A star is born. This guy has the ingredients to be a pop scientist, and of course, there's a great tradition in pop scientists. I mean, Neil deGrasse Tyson, I heard earlier on, who is a pop scientist too. He's a more respectable and more respectful and more likeable example of a pop scientist. There's others: Sir Patrick Moore, Arthur C. Clarke, Richard Feynman, Stephen Hawking has become a bit of a pop scientist too, and it looks like Cox is the latest addition to that club, but he's more than that. And his career, literally, it just shot up overnight. He became a household name. And as I said, his media work is continuous. He goes off to posh hotels and luxury resorts on the BBC tab, on the licence payer's expense. And he minces around in front of the camera. You know. And he was knighted by the Queen, of course. He's now Professor Brian Edward Cox, OBE. Yes, and he is he's a sex symbol. I mean, I talk to women about this, and there are some that do find him attractive, and I know a friend of mine actually is besotted with him. But I've spoken to other women who do not find him appealing at all. It's his lack of masculinity. I mean, he is extremely effeminate. And he's arrogant, and they find the arrogance of him and his narrow-mindedness. A lot of women find that repulsive. And I've said this before on YouTube, and I've said it in jest. I've said it just joked. Many a true word is spoken in jest, but I suspect that Professor Brian Cox is being groomed to take over the role of both of token media skeptic, the skeptic they get in, like Professor Chris French, whenever they're doing anything about the paranormal or conspiracy theory or anything like that. But I think he's going to do more. I think he's destined for a different role, a unique role. I actually met Cox once. I went to a Skeptics in a Pub event in London. I paid just £5 to get in. You know, it was at a pub. You couldn't. This was before he was really famous. You couldn't do that now. I think the gatekeepers of the secret science, of the powers that be, of the New World Order, are they are what they are. They want to create someone special, and a special kind of figure, and Cox is the first recruit for the post. And it's not just the carefully scripted documentaries. It's not just the. It's the things like that. It's his whole attitude. I mean, he is a zealot. He is, as I said, he's an arrogant, abusive man. I mean, he's this woman I told you about who's besotted with him. She writes to him all the time about everything. Whenever I put something on my blog or I make a video about him, she copies it to him. And he only ever wrote back to her once. And he didn't write back to her. He wrote back to her indirectly by tweeting, "A notice to nutters. I don't respect your opinion and I will be rude to you." He is rude, you see. I don't mind Professor Chris French. Professor Chris French is a reasonably nice guy. French actually invited me to speak at one of his conferences. But Cox is different. Cox calls people knobbers. If people like me who like take the idea of the paranormal seriously. He calls us knobbers. It's an event. It's a word he made up. He calls us, what is it? He calls us fucking morons, twats, and things like that. He uses these words all the time. And there's an anecdotal story of him jumping out of a taxi in an enraged tantrum because the driver tried to argue with him, and he said that the moon landings were faked or something like that. And I can believe it happening. It's an unconfirmed story, but I can believe it happening. Now, yeah, he said this is the actual tweet that he actually sent to my friend, who is a very, very nice young woman who I'm very fond of. She's a good platonic friend of mine, and she is a fan of Cox's. She thinks he's wonderful, and she writes admiring letters to him, and she also sends him copies of things that I've said about him. She links to him and to that, and he said, "A note to nutters. If you want, we value your opinion response. Don't use my personal email. I don't value your opinion, and I will call you names." And it's this bigotry which I think is a crucial ingredient, which his employers, the BBC and the media in general, have taken into account when they want to see if he's the right man for the job. And I don't think, I know when it comes to propaganda and things like that, most of the people are not, they're not people who are lying. They're not taken to one side and say, look, Brian, this is what's really going on, but don't tell anyone, will you? I think they're just useful idiots. They are people who actually believe the crap they're spouting. And for that reason, then they can spout it and be 100% sincere. They can't swap benches. They can't decide to change their minds and start and confess. So this makes them much more effective than knowing people who are briefed in, people who are initiated into the secrecy. So, and also it's the ego factor. People with an ego are very easy to corrupt because they will follow whoever feeds their ego. And they can fool themselves into thinking they're not, but they will. They will follow. If you massage their ego and drag them along by their ego, you can actually make them do whatever you like. And this is why a lot of spies, you know, if people are during the Cold War and things like that, when they were recruiting spies, a lot of these people were simply people who had an ego. And this is why in one of the stories of the Buddha, he has to confront his own ego. He's faced with an image of himself, his doppelganger. When he's crouched under the tree, squatting under the tree, trying to find enlightenment, he's faced with his own ego, who urges the Buddha to worship him. And the Buddha says, "Lord of my own ego, you are mere illusion." And it's only then can he become enlightened, and he can become the Buddha. I mean, let's talk about Science Britannica. Okay, Science Britannica is extraordinarily one-sided. It brings up genetically modified food a couple of times. It interviews scientists working on GM crops in laboratories about how safe GMOs are. And this one, oh my god, what was that? Oh dear. It's alright. It's not Cox breaking down the door to beat me up. Beat me up. Beat me up! I could do that and he'd fall over. He'd go flat on his back. Now, yeah, and they show these boiler-suited protesters at Rothamsted and things like that. There's no dissenting voice in it at all. And the same goes for animal testing, things like that, and about how they don't bring in someone who's against animal testing and says, well, there's alternatives that they don't use because they don't want to spend the money. They'd rather just kill animals. And even things like even creatures like monkeys, more intelligent creatures they kill as well. I think the role that Professor Brian Cox is going to be assigned is a kind of scientific propagandist combined with other kinds of propagandists, and I don't know exactly what form that will be literally, but I think it's going to be different to like the other pop scientists and the other pop skeptics. Yeah, I mean it's interesting. David Attenborough. You remember David Attenborough, the guy who used to go into the jungle and cuddle up with gorillas? And I used to love those programs. I used to really like them. And he brought these things to the public, and it was a good job. Now he has named Professor Brian Cox as his natural successor because David Attenborough's getting old, and they need someone young and handsome and virile to take over from that old fart, you know. So Attenborough said, "Well, Cox is my natural successor." This is even though Cox is he's not a biologist, he's a physicist. He's still the natural successor of David Attenborough. How many biologists would want to do what David Attenborough did? And like to present programs to the BBC. People who actually know about the subject they're talking about. Loads of them. But they won't have him, no, because they've got to have that smiling simian at the small screen. You know. God. So I'll be keeping an eye on Professor Brian Cox. I mean, he did this program called The Wonders of Life, which was kind of like a very cheap imitation of Attenborough's old programs. So, what's interesting about Cox, another interesting thing about Cox is his wife. Now, it's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? The handler. There's the agent. There's the person who is the kind of like asset of the intelligence services, the mind control victim, the mind controlled or useful idiot person, and then they have a handler. They have someone who's sort of managing them, and it's almost always the partner. It's the wife, it's the husband, it's the boyfriend or girlfriend. And there are exceptions. I mean, for instance, in the book and the film called The Manchurian Candidate, it's the mother. But in most real situations, it is the partner. Now, Cox's wife is called Gia Milinovich, and she works in the media. She's very experienced in the media behind the scenes. She's worked in various TV productions in Japan and the United States. She's American herself. She's a very hardline feminist. I've listened to her speak. And she's a member of several kind of fifth column organisations. There's one called the Lifeboat Foundation and things like that. And which is one of these kind of... There's something a bit sort of cultural Marxist about what she's involved with. And being a feminist, of course, makes her very culturally Marxist. So I can't help thinking, you know, if you want to make media propaganda, you need people who will... You need people like that. And so maybe she's part of the kind of control structure behind Cox. I don't know this. I'm not accusing her. Okay, I'm just saying that in the case of you get someone who's like a big public figure, and they are mind controlled or they're useful idiots, someone will be managing them behind the scenes, and it's usually the partner. Now, this is certainly the case with President Clinton, Bill Clinton, because Hillary, not only we had a narrow escape from her being the bloody president herself, luckily we got Trump instead, but I'm sure she was handler of Bill Clinton. There's actually some outtakes from the Larry King show where Clinton's been done up with makeup in the makeup room, and he's like this. His eyes are drooping, and then the makeup person's gone like that, and he is in a trance. That is MK Ultra mind control. It's real. It is real. It's a real thing. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's been historically documented. It exists. So I'll be keeping a good eye on this person, whatever you call him. Oh, I don't know what I'm going to call him actually. I just can't abide him. I really can't. So so we shall see what happens next. I'll be sure to give you an update if there's any more news about that little shiny-toothed, smooth-haired, baby-faced gimp that we always see whenever we switch on the TV, whenever I can bear it. I hardly ever watch the bastard nowadays. It's just so much crap on there. 99% of it's crap, and the 1% worth watching always ends up online. I've got a TV in the house, but I never watch it. So thank you for watching Panel TV on VidMe, Hospital Porters, Pride and Dignity, Stop the New World Order.